In the chill of early morning, when fog still clung to the shoreline of Martha's Vineyard, the island seemed like any other quiet settlement off the coast of New England. Waves rolled in from the Atlantic, gulls circled lazily above the weathered docks, and smoke rose from chimneys in small, salt-stained cottages. To an outsider, nothing about the place seemed unusual. Fishermen mended their nets, children darted down narrow lanes, and neighbors greeted one another with nods of familiarity. But listen closer. Pause in the stillness of the streets, and you would notice something uncanny. Conversations unfolded not with voices, but with hands. Silence hung over gatherings that should have been filled with laughter and chatter. Even arguments played out in eerie quiet, punctuated only by the rush of the sea. This was not silence born of shyness, nor of fear. It was the silence of a people who did not need words. For in this community, in the late 19th century, deafness was not an exception, it was the norm. They called it Chilmark, a small town on Martha's Vineyard, where entire families carried within them a genetic legacy that set them apart. Generation after generation, children were born without the ability to hear, and often without the ability to speak. Yet, unlike so many other places in the world, where such children would have been outcasts, pitied, or even hidden from view, here they lived openly. Their silence shaped the rhythm of the village, and their language, sign language, was woven seamlessly into daily life. Imagine arriving by boat as a traveler in 1870. You step onto the dock expecting to hear the banter of dock workers or the haggling of fishmongers. Instead, you are met with hands in motion. A fisherman jokes with his neighbor using gestures, his laughter visible only in the creases of his face. Children play tag in the streets, their shouts absent, but their delight unmistakable. A mother scolds his son with sharp, deliberate signs, and the boy lowers his head in shame, even without a sound. And what unsettles you most is not the absence of noise, it's the normality of it. No one seems to find it strange. The silence belongs here. This was not a coincidence. Centuries earlier, a gene had crossed the Atlantic with settlers from a remote corner of England, where deafness already threaded its way through families. Isolated on the island, bound together by blood and tradition, that gene took root. By the mid-1800s, 1 in every 25 people in Chilmark was born deaf, a number unimaginably high compared to the mainland. Whole households might consist of deaf parents, deaf children, deaf grandparents. And because it was so common, the hearing learned to sign just as readily as the deaf. The result was a town where silence was not a burden, it was a way of life. But within this quiet existence lay a mystery that still lingers today. For beneath the harmony of a community that seemed to transcend disability, darker questions stir. What happens when silence becomes the fabric of a culture? What fears linger in the hush between gestures? And how did a gene carried across an ocean shape not only bodies, but an entire way of life? The story of Martha's Vineyard is not only about science, nor only about history. It is about the blurred line between acceptance and isolation, between community and secrecy. To some, it was a utopia, a place where the deaf could live without shame, their difference erased by collective understanding. To others, it was a strange, unsettling pocket of America, where an invisible inheritance bound people together in silence. And like so many dark histories, the truth lies somewhere in between. Imagine the nighttime streets of Chilmark, lanterns dim, shutters drawn, the sea groaning in the distance. From a window, you glimpse a family gathered at their table, hands flickering in rapid conversation while their faces remain still. There is warmth, yes, but also something spectral in the scene, as though you are witnessing a world half removed from your own. Without voices to fill the air, even joy feels ghostly, as though shadows themselves are speaking. Travelers told stories of the strangeness of it. A man arriving from Boston wrote that he felt as though he had stumbled into another country, one without sound, where even the barking of dogs seemed muted against the sheer force of silence. Some spoke with fascination, others with unease, but all agreed Martha's Vineyard was like no other place in America. Yet silence can be deceptive. Beneath the surface, families still carried grief. Deafness, though accepted here, brought challenges. Some children faced illness and death young, their frail bodies tied not only to silence, but to a legacy of hardship. And when the outside world peered in, it did not always look with kindness. To visitors, this was a curiosity to be studied, perhaps even a weakness to be exploited. And so, as we begin our journey into the story of the deaf-mute town of Martha's Vineyard, we enter a landscape caught between light and shadow. It is the tale of a people who lived differently, who thrived in a silence that others might have found unbearable. But it is also a tale of fate, of genes and generations, of how one inherited trait could shape the destiny of an entire community. Tonight, we step into the quiet, into a village where words never rose above a whisper, where children grew up without sound, and the silence of the sea seemed to seep into every home. We will explore how this world came to be, what it meant for those who lived it, and why its legacy continues to haunt us even now. For in silence, there is always something hidden. And on Martha's Vineyard, that silence was not just absence, it was a presence, one that demands to be remembered. To understand the strange silence of Martha's Vineyard, we must first step back in time to an era when the island was still young and its shores had only just begun to draw settlers from across the Atlantic. Long before the wharves filled with fishing boats and the small towns took shape, the island belonged to the Wampanoag people, who lived there for thousands of years. They called the island Noepe, the land between the streams. Their villages spread along the coast, their lives shaped by fishing, farming, and seasonal rhythms. For the Wampanoag, the sea was a lifeline, and their communities thrived on a balance between land and water. But in the early 1600s, English colonists arrived. First, they came as fishermen, then as settlers, drawn by fertile soil and the promise of independence. By 1642, families from Kent County, England, began to establish permanent homes in what would become Chilmark, Tisbury, and other small villages scattered across the island. Among these settlers, tucked in the folds of family genealogies, was the hidden thread of a mutation, a gene carried quietly, invisibly through bloodlines. At the time, no one could have imagined its future influence. This gene had its roots in the Weald region of Kent, a part of England known for its isolation and close-knit communities. There, deafness was already a recurring condition, passed from parent to child in patterns no one yet understood. When families from Kent sailed to Martha's Vineyard, they brought with them not only their customs, their dialects, and their Protestant faith, but also this recessive trait. On the mainland of England, where populations were larger, such a mutation might have diluted over generations. But here, on the edges of Massachusetts, in a place separated by ocean, the gene found fertile ground. Martha's Vineyard in the 17th and 18th centuries was a world apart from the bustling ports of Boston or the growing towns of Connecticut. It was an island of rugged self-sufficiency. Fishing and whaling sustained its economy, while farming filled cellars with corn, beans, and squash. Families often intermarried not out of preference, but out of necessity. With a small population and limited newcomers, kinship ties deepened across generations. And in that interwoven fabric of families, the gene spread quietly, unmarked and unremarked upon, until its effects became visible. By the late 18th century, cases of deafness began to appear with unusual frequency. Records show entire households where multiple children were deaf, as well as marriages between deaf and hearing individuals that produced still more deaf offspring. Unlike in other parts of the world where deafness often led to isolation, here it produced adaptation. Because the deaf were so common, the hearing learned to sign as naturally as they spoke. This was not yet the American Sign Language we know today, but a homegrown system, Martha's Vineyard Sign Language, or MVSL. It grew organically, shaped by the needs of families and neighbors, until it was as natural a form of communication as spoken English. Imagine the whaling crews of the 1700s, men on deck gesturing across the roar of the sea, signing commands that carried more clearly than shouted words. Farmers in the fields gesturing instructions across rows of crops. Children signing games as fluidly as if they were speaking. MVSL became a cultural glue, binding together deaf and hearing alike. In Chilmark, everyone was bilingual. They could speak aloud, but they could also speak in silence. The historical backdrop of this phenomenon reveals not only genetics, but also the social fabric of an island community. For while other towns in colonial America viewed disability as a mark of weakness, often hiding or excluding those born different, Martha's Vineyard did the opposite. Deafness was normalized, woven into the ordinary rhythm of life. This cultural acceptance was so complete that visitors often remarked they could not tell at first glance who was deaf and who was not. Still, beneath this harmony lay currents of isolation. Though accepted within their own towns, the death of Martha's Vineyard carried an invisible barrier to the outside world. When they traveled to Boston or New York, they stepped into a society that did not share their silence. There, their condition marked them as curiosities or burdens. And so for many, the island became both refuge and prison, a place where they belonged, but also one that cut them off from the wider world. By the 19th century, the island's reputation was spreading. Word of this unusual community began to reach scholars, doctors, and educators who were fascinated by the concentration of deafness. In 1817, when the American School for the Deaf opened in Hartford, Connecticut, children from Martha's Vineyard were among its earliest students. There they learned a more formalized system of sign language, which would eventually blend with MVSL to shape the foundations of modern American Sign Language. In this way, the silent legacy of Chilmark extended far beyond the island's shores. The broader historical context of 19th century America provides another layer to this story. The country was in the throes of industrial growth, urbanization, and social reform. Institutions for the deaf, blind, and mentally ill were being established, often with mixed intentions, sometimes rooted in genuine compassion, sometimes in paternalistic control. While many Americans still viewed disability as tragedy, the Vineyard stood as an anomaly, a place where difference was not marginalized but shared. And yet, acceptance did not erase hardship. Deaf children, even in Chilmark, were vulnerable to accidents and illness. Farming and fishing were perilous trades, injuries were common, and without the ability to call out for help, a deaf worker might be more easily lost to the sea or the scythe. Families carried not only the daily burden of survival, but also the weight of knowing their children were part of a lineage that would not end with them, generations of deafness linked past to present, as if silence itself were an inheritance. The mid-1800s brought more change. Whaling declined, agriculture shifted, and with it, the social structures of the island began to loosen. More outsiders arrived, traders, tourists, new settlers, and with them came voices, noise, and the slow dilution of the genetic concentration that had once defined Chilmark. Still, for decades more, the town retained its character as a place of shared silence. It was a culture as old as the stone walls lining the fields, as enduring as the tides. Looking back, the historical background of Martha's Vineyard is not simply the story of a gene carried across the Atlantic. It is the story of how environment and inheritance intertwined. The physical isolation of the island preserved not only family names and traditions, but also traits, both admired and feared. In this way, history itself became complicit in shaping biology. There is something haunting in this convergence. One can almost imagine those first settlers stepping ashore, their boots sinking into sand, unaware of the legacy they carried. A single mutation, hidden in their blood, would spread quietly across generations until it defined an entire town. It is a reminder of how fragile and powerful the threads of history can be, how chance, environment, and human choice can combine to shape lives for centuries. And so, the silence of Martha's Vineyard was not born in a single moment. It was centuries in the making, a fusion of old world inheritance and new world isolation. By the time the 19th century dawned, the quiet streets of Chilmark were already steeped in this history. Each gesture, each signed word carried not only meaning, but also the weight of generations. To outsiders, it seemed uncanny, even ghostly. To those within, it was simply life. The island's past, then, is more than background. It is the soil from which the mystery grew. Without its unique history of settlement, kinship, and isolation, the deaf-mute town might never have existed. But because it did, the silence that defined Martha's Vineyard became both a cultural treasure and a haunting reminder of how history shapes the human body itself.
Life on Martha's Vineyard in the 19th century unfolded slowly, marked by the rhythms of sea and soil. At first glance, it seemed like any other New England settlement. Clapboard houses standing against the salt wind, white churches rising above low stone walls, men hauling nets from the shore, women tending to gardens and hearths. But beneath that ordinary exterior, the vineyard carried with it a strangeness that outsiders could not ignore. Silence was everywhere, not the silence of solitude, but a shared quiet that spread across homes, schools, and town meetings. In Chilmark especially, where the gene for deafness ran deep, entire families communicated without sound. Even at the busiest crossroads, one might pass by a group of neighbors gesturing fluidly, their hands moving like the tide, their expressions carrying stories that voices never told. For those who belonged, it was natural. For strangers, it was uncanny, a town that spoke in shadows. The incidents that punctuated this history were not always spectacular, but they carried a weight that gave rise to the town's haunted reputation. Each carried within it the mixture of vulnerability and resilience that defined a community bound by silence. Consider the child who fell from the hayloft one summer afternoon. His father had been stacking bales, and the boy, curious, climbed after him. The beams were high, the floor uneven, and when he slipped, there was no scream to warn anyone below. He struck the barn floor with a sickening thud. The father turned at the sound, too late, and only then realized what had happened. In another town, the child's cry might have summoned help before the fall. Here, there was nothing, only silence. followed by a crowd of hands frantically signing for aid. The boy lived, though with a limp that marked him for life. The incident spread through Chilmark like a whisper, not as gossip, but as a reminder of the fragile line between ordinary life and sudden tragedy. There was the girl who wandered too close to the shoreline during a storm, entranced by the waves crashing white against the rocks. She did not hear the warning shouts of fishermen as the tide rose, nor the rush of water pulling her feet from beneath her. By the time they reached her, she was floating face down, her hair tangled in seaweed. Pulled to shore, she coughed and gasped, her chest heaving, saved by chance rather than caution. Later, in the warmth of her family's kitchen, she signed her story, how the sea had seemed to call her, how its roar was something she could never truly hear, but always felt in her bones. For her, as for many, danger carried a different shape. Sound never served as a barrier. Only sight and instinct could protect her, and sometimes even those were not enough. Accidents like these gave the town its aura of unease. To visitors, it seemed as if silence itself invited calamity. To the people of Chilmark, it was simply part of life. A boy cut his hand with a sickle and could not call for help. A man chopping wood with his son nearby swung the axe too wide and no warning cry came before it struck. A young woman pricked by a sewing needle developed an infection that grew worse because she could not describe the pain until it had spread. Each case was followed not only by care and sympathy, but also by an unspoken question. Was this silence a blessing or a curse? But not all incidents were accidents. Some were moments of eerie, almost supernatural strangeness. One evening in winter, as the snow fell heavy over the island, neighbors gathered in a farmhouse for a wake. A man had died at sea, his boat capsized in sudden squalls. His body, battered by the waves, had been brought home, and the community assembled to mourn. In the dim lamplight, mourners stood in silence, their hands moving in solemn gestures, a funeral without spoken prayers. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the moan of wind against the walls. To outsiders who once attended such rituals, it was chilling. An entire room of people mourning wordlessly, their grief expressed only in flickers of the hand, like shadows cast by the flames. For those present, it was deeply moving, but for the stranger who later recounted it in Boston, it was something else. A church without voices, a death without lamentation. He wrote of it in a letter, and the story spread, adding to the island's mystique.
There were darker tales still, stories whispered among children at dusk, as if the silence itself harbored ghosts. One such story told of a boy who vanished in the woods. He had gone to gather kindling and never returned. Search parties combed the thickets, gesturing to one another through the trees, calling silently with flashing hands. They found his hat by a frozen pond. The ice cracked where he had likely fallen through. But the body was never recovered. For weeks afterward, mothers warned their children not to wander alone, signing the story of the vanished boy with trembling fingers. Some swore that in the quiet of the woods you could still see him, his pale face beneath the ice, watching without a sound. Even the sea carried its share of sinister silence. More than once, fishermen were lost to sudden squalls. On the open water, cries carried poorly against the wind, but for the deaf, no sound carried at all. When a mast cracked or a rope snapped, warnings came too late. Entire crews returned short-handed, with one man missing, his absence marked by a single empty place at the table. To outsiders, it seemed the ocean was swallowing them, one by one, as if punishing the town for its silence. To the families left behind, it was grief compounded by inevitability. They lived on an island, bound to the sea. Loss was part of the contract. The incidents extended into the realm of the uncanny, where outsiders found themselves unsettled by ordinary things. A traveler once described walking through Chilmark at dusk, seeing figures gesturing in the road, their movements illuminated only by lantern light. He wrote of how the silence was oppressive, how he felt as though he had stumbled into a world of phantoms who spoke without sound. Another visitor claimed that even animals seemed affected, that dogs barked less, that chickens clucked softly, as if the silence of humans had bled into the very land. Such tales may have been exaggerations, yet they reveal how unsettling the town could seem to those unfamiliar with it. Children growing up in this environment knew a world both safe and dangerous. They played games in silence, their laughter expressed in wide smiles rather than sound. They told ghost stories with their hands, shadows flickering across walls. But they also bore the risks of their condition. More than one child was struck by a horse cart because they did not hear its wheels on the dirt road. Fires broke out in kitchens, the crackle and smoke going unnoticed until flames licked the rafters. Parents taught their children to watch with vigilance, to feel the vibrations of the ground, to sense danger in ways others took for granted. It gave them resilience, but it also painted life in darker shades. These repeated incidents, accidents, disappearances, deaths, formed the fabric of what outsiders came to view as a cursed town. Newspapers occasionally carried brief notes reporting on the extraordinary frequency of the deaf and dumb on Martha's Vineyard, and hinting at the tragedies that followed. One writer called it a land of silence and sorrow. Another claimed the people were touched by some ancient curse, doomed to suffer the sea and the silence together. The truth was more complex, rooted in genetics and isolation. But to a world hungry for mystery, the Vineyard became a storybook of eerie events. Yet for the townspeople themselves, the incidents were not horror, but endurance. They buried their dead, they mended their wounds, they carried on. Life did not pause for grief. A man who lost his son at sea still went out the next morning with his nets. A woman who lost her daughter to illness still baked bread for her surviving children. Silence shaped them, but it did not destroy them. It bound them to one another in ways outsiders could not see. Every incident, every accident, every whispered tale added another layer to their resilience. By the late 19th century, the stories had begun to blur into legend. Children of hearing parents signed fluently alongside deaf peers. Outsiders who came seeking strangeness left with tales of ghostly towns where no voices rose. The incidents, though often ordinary tragedies of rural life, were transformed in the telling, becoming markers of something uncanny, something haunted. The truth of Martha's Vineyard lay somewhere between, a place where silence was not a curse, but a condition of life, and where incidents both mundane and extraordinary unfolded within that quiet. And yet, even within the community, a sense of unease lingered. Each accident reminded families of their vulnerability. Each disappearance haunted the woods and the sea. Each funeral conducted in silence seemed to deepen the town's aura of mystery. The incidents never stopped. They only accumulated, layer upon layer, until the history of Chilmark seemed steeped in a silence that was at once ordinary and terrifying. It was not one tragedy, nor one mystery that gave the town its reputation. It was the steady drumbeat of incidents over generations, each one echoing in silence, each one leaving behind questions that could never be fully answered.
The incidents that haunted Martha's Vineyard did not exist in a vacuum. They rippled outward, stirring responses that revealed as much about the world beyond the island as they did about the people who lived within it. For the families of Chilmark, each accident was absorbed into the rhythm of life. Grief was acknowledged, but never indulged in excess. They lived by necessity. The sea demanded labor, the fields required tending, and silence left no room for extravagant displays of mourning. When a child drowned or a fisherman failed to return, the family gathered in silence, their hands moving in gestures heavy with sorrow. No cries pierced the night, no wails echoed across the village. Instead, grief was carried with restraint, woven into daily life. For them, this was not unusual. It was survival. Neighbors reacted in kind. When disaster struck one household, others brought food, cut wood, repaired nets. Their solidarity was practical and immediate. A fisherman's widow might find her firewood stacked neatly the next morning, her barn door mended, her pantry replenished by unseen hands. Aid was not asked for, it simply appeared, silently delivered, a reflection of a community bound together not by words, but by shared hardship. Outsiders mistook this for coldness. In truth, it was endurance, an understanding that silence could not be filled with noise, but only with presence. The clergy of the island faced a unique challenge. Ministers trained to preach with fire and voice found themselves in sanctuaries filled with parishioners who understood little of sound. Some clergy attempted to shout louder, their voices echoing through wooden rafters, convinced they might penetrate the silence. Others adapted, learning the signs of their flock, delivering sermons with hands as much as mouths. A handful found the experience profoundly unsettling, as if their words were vanishing into a void. One preacher visiting from the mainland confessed in a letter that he felt as though he had been speaking to the dead, for not a single ear seemed to hear, nor a single voice to answer Amen. Yet for Vineyard families, religion remained central, practiced in silence that to them felt natural, even sacred. Doctors, too, struggled to interpret the condition that defined Chilmark. Some believed the deafness was a divine punishment, a curse, for sins buried in forgotten generations. Others, more curious than fearful, collected data with clinical detachment, sketching family trees, noting each instance of deafness as if cataloging specimens. In 1854, Jonathan Lambert, himself deaf, became a point of fascination for medical men who came to observe. To them, he was a case study. To his neighbors, he was simply Jonathan, who tilled his land and tended his livestock like anyone else. Yet the reactions of physicians and scholars from the mainland fed into the perception that Chilmark was an aberration, a place marked by science as much as by rumor. The newspapers amplified this strangeness. Reporters described the island in tones of wonder and dread, calling it a land where silence reigns supreme, or the town without voices. They wrote of funerals conducted entirely without sound, of children playing games with ghostly gestures, of fishermen vanishing at sea without a single cry. These accounts fascinated readers in Boston and New York, feeding a growing appetite for the macabre. They portrayed Chilmark not as a community, but as a curiosity, a living folktale of silence and sorrow. Families who had endured loss found themselves turned into spectacles, their grief reinterpreted for audiences far away. Among the islanders themselves, reactions varied. Some wore their silence with quiet pride, believing it set them apart, even above the noisy world beyond the shore. Others felt the sting of shame, particularly when outsiders stared or mocked. A young man traveling to Boston for work found himself treated as simple-minded because he signed instead of spoke. He returned home bitter, vowing never again to leave the island. Stories like his reinforced the community's insularity, deepening the divide between vineyard life and the wider world. Children absorbed these reactions in ways adults scarcely noticed. They grew up knowing that outsiders found them strange, sometimes frightening. They heard, or rather saw, stories of themselves turned into curiosities.
Yet they also inherited a resilience that came from living in a place where silence was not deficiency, but language. For them, reactions from beyond the island mattered little. What mattered was whether they could fish, farm, and endure. Still, the seeds of unease were planted, and with each generation, the awareness of difference grew heavier.
At times, even the island's own hearing residents felt conflicted. Some accepted silence as part of the fabric of their lives, learning signs as fluently as speech. Others resented the way it marked them in the eyes of outsiders. There were whispered conversations, sometimes spoken, sometimes signed, about whether the town was cursed, whether the silence would ever end. Some feared marrying within the community, afraid of passing the condition to their children. Others dismissed such fears, claiming the silence was no curse but a unique inheritance, a bond that tied them more tightly than sound ever could. Reactions from the sea itself seemed inevitable, as though the elements conspired to echo the silence. Storms rose suddenly, swallowing fishermen whole. The ocean did not respond to cries for help, because there were none. To mainland observers, it seemed almost poetic, a silent people claimed by a silent sea. Such interpretations, though unfair, hardened the image of the Vineyard as a place where life and death unfolded beyond the reach of sound. In Boston drawing rooms and New York lecture halls, intellectuals debated what Martha's Vineyard revealed about human society. Some hailed it as proof that communities could thrive without spoken language, that silence need not mean isolation. Others painted it as a warning of degeneration, a community shrinking inward under the weight of genetic flaw. Both views distorted the lived reality of Chilmark families, but both fed the legend. Reactions from afar transformed ordinary people into symbols, their lives into metaphors. For the islanders, these reactions were often invisible, distant echoes carried across the water. Their immediate world remained practical and close, repairing nets, surviving winters, mourning losses in silence. Yet even they could not entirely ignore the growing fascination. Strangers arrived more often, curious to witness the mute town. Some came with genuine respect, others with condescension, still others with morbid curiosity. The reactions they carried back to the mainland only deepened the sense that Chilmark was less a village than a story. And so the cycle continued. Incidents gave rise to reactions, reactions fed into legend, and legend returned to shape how both outsiders and islanders viewed themselves. Each response added weight to the silence, until Martha's Vineyard seemed less like a place and more like a stage upon which silence itself played its part. Families grieved and endured, ministers struggled to preach, doctors cataloged, newspapers sensationalized, and strangers stared. Together, their reactions wove the fabric of myth that still clings to the Vineyard, a myth of silence both ordinary and unsettling, both human and haunted. The story of Martha's Vineyard's silent village did not build toward its climax with the crash of a single catastrophe, but rather with the slow accumulation of unease, generation upon generation of accidents, tragedies, and strange survivals that seemed to gather mass until they could no longer be ignored. It was as though the island itself had been waiting, holding its breath, until silence became not simply the language of a people, but the echo of something larger, something that pressed down upon the place with a weight that could not be measured. It began, fittingly, with a storm. The Vineyard had known many, but this one struck with peculiar violence. In the late autumn of the 1870s, a gale rolled in from the Atlantic, dragging black water and bitter winds over the low coast. Families gathered inside their cottages, the shutters rattling, the roofs groaning under the weight of the squall. Normally, the cries of fear, the shouts for assistance, would have filled such a night. But in Chilmark, the storm unfolded in eerie quiet. Children clung to their parents' arms, their eyes wide, watching the house tremble. Neighbors peered out windows to gauge damage, but no one screamed when the barn roofs lifted, when trees snapped in half like brittle bones. The silence turned the storm into something spectral, a performance without sound. To those who survived it, the memory was less of the violence of wind than of the feeling that the world itself had been erased, replaced by a void. In the days after, the devastation became clear. Fishing boats had been lost, cattle swept away, fences destroyed. A family near Squibnocket was found huddled in their ruined home, the father gone to secure the roof and never returning. His wife stood over the broken timbers, her hands moving desperately in frantic signs that told the neighbors what had happened. They nodded, sharing her grief in gestures, their eyes as bleak as hers. No wailing split the air, no curses thrown against the storm. They rebuilt in silence, as they always had. But the outsiders who arrived weeks later, to help and to report, wrote of the storm in tones of horror, marveling that an entire town had endured catastrophe without a single sound. It was, one journalist wrote, as though death itself passed through them and no one dared to speak. The storm was not the only turning point, only the most visible. Within the same season, a string of smaller incidents gnawed at the village. A boy fell from a ladder while repairing a loft. He lay broken on the ground, his face twisted in agony, yet no scream passed his lips. A fisherman sliced his hand open, gutting a catch, blood spilling across the deck, and his companions, themselves mute, guided him back to shore without a word. A girl just 15 was found drowned in a pond, her hair drifting like weeds beneath the surface. She had wandered alone, and no one heard her thrashing. These moments piled together, each one a reminder that silence could protect, but also destroy. The community bore them with stoic endurance, yet beneath the surface, unease spread like a shadow. The outside world pressed closer. Scholars and physicians arrived more frequently, sketchbooks in hand, eager to record the phenomenon of the mute town. They lingered during funerals, watching the mourners communicate in gestures, fascinated by the absence of sound. To them, it was an anthropological curiosity. To the families, it was intrusion. The climax was not a single accident, but this collision between a way of life and the interpretations forced upon it by others. Islanders began to feel like subjects in a spectacle. Their silence turned into theater for strangers. Some resented it fiercely, others withdrew further into themselves. The pressure built quietly, like a storm behind the horizon. It found its breaking point on an otherwise ordinary day. A funeral was being held for a fisherman lost at sea. The church filled with families, men and women dressed in black, children seated solemnly in the pews. The minister, himself hearing, stood at the pulpit and began to preach. His voice echoed against the wooden beams, rising in cadence, yet the congregation sat still, their faces unreadable. A group of scholars, having secured permission to attend, sat in the back, scribbling notes furiously. One of them later described the moment. The minister shouted with passion, but the silence of the mourners swallowed his voice until it seemed he spoke to the grave itself.
Midway through the service, the widow rose, her hands lifted, trembling, and she began to sign. Every face turned to her, and soon dozens of hands rose with hers, filling the air with movement. It was a chorus without sound, gestures flowing, sentences spun in the language of the mute. To the outsiders in the back, it was overwhelming, even terrifying. They had never witnessed grief expressed without voice, only in motion. The scholar wrote later that he felt as though he was watching a ritual of another world, the theater of the dead enacted by the living. That funeral marked the climax of perception. For the islanders, it was a natural, collective moment of grief. For outsiders, it confirmed their worst imaginings, that Martha's Vineyard was a place apart, where silence had replaced humanity itself. The reports that followed sensationalized the funeral, describing it as a ceremony of ghosts, the living mimicking the motions of the departed. These words spread through newspapers, fixing Chilmark's reputation in the popular imagination, not as a community, but as a mystery. The villagers carried on, as they always had. They repaired their homes, fished their seas, tended their fields. But after the storm, after the accidents, after the funeral that outsiders turned into legend, a sense of being observed never left them. The silence that once belonged to them alone was now projected outward, magnified, turned into a story the world would not forget. In that moment, through storm, tragedy, and spectacle, the town of silence reached its climax. It was not the collapse of a building, nor the vanishing of a family, but the crystallization of myth. Martha's Vineyard had become more than itself, a symbol, a legend of quiet horror, where every accident seemed magnified by the absence of screams, and every act of mourning transformed into an image for others to consume. The silence had always been there, but now it was seen, written, remembered. It was no longer the language of a community alone, but the defining mark of an island caught between history and haunting. And so the climax was not an end, but a sealing. From that moment forward, the deaf-mute town was never just a place. It was a story, fixed in the imagination of America, carried in whispers and written in ink. A town of silence, forever standing at the edge of storm and sea, where tragedy played out without a sound, and where the absence of voices grew louder than any cry could ever be.
In the end, silence remained. Not the silence of absence, not the silence of death, but the silence of a language that had bound an entire community together for centuries. And yet, as the years passed, that same silence became myth, retold as though it were something supernatural, a haunting rather than a history. Outsiders wrote of it with a fascination that often blurred fact and imagination. They spoke of the island where storms raged without screams, where children played without laughter, where funerals unfolded in eerie choreography of hands. To them, it was something uncanny, a place touched by otherworldly forces. But to those who lived it, it was simply life. By the close of the 19th century, the tide was already shifting. The world beyond Martha's Vineyard grew noisier, modernity creeping in with steamships and telegraphs, with newspapers and telephones. Education spread, medicine advanced, and with it came new understandings of heredity and deafness. The island's once isolated gene pool began to mingle with the mainland. Fewer children were born into silence. The old language of signs, once universal, began to fade from common use. Slowly, the silence loosened its grip, and yet, even as it receded, the memory of it remained, casting a long shadow over the island's identity. Visitors arrived with notebooks, sketching not only faces and hands, but stories, some true, others distorted. They wrote of a village that seemed cut off from time, where the line between the living and the spectral blurred. They carried these tales back to cities, printing them in papers, embedding them in lecture halls, turning Chilmark into a legend. The people of the island were aware of these stories, though they rarely responded. They continued their lives in the way they always had, fishing, farming, raising families. Yet a quiet weight pressed upon them, a sense of being remembered in ways they could not control. In truth, the mystery of Martha's Vineyard lies not in supernatural whispers, but in the stubborn endurance of silence as both burden and gift. Imagine the small boy who falls and feels no need to scream, because everyone around him already understands his pain without a sound. Imagine the widow who stands over her husband's coffin, her hands trembling in the air, surrounded by neighbors who grieve with her in wordless unison. Imagine the children who grow up knowing two worlds, the noisy one they encounter in books and strangers, and the quiet one that defines their homes. What appears ghostly to outsiders was, to the islanders, nothing more than the ordinary texture of life. And yet, there is something undeniably haunting about that ordinariness. Because silence on Martha's Vineyard was not an absence, it was a presence, as real and solid as the Atlantic winds or the salt-crusted docks. It filled every room, every conversation, every moment of crisis and joy. Outsiders often mistook it for emptiness, but the truth is that silence there was thick with meaning, a current that carried the island through its centuries. When it finally began to dissipate, when spoken words replaced the old signs, something precious slipped quietly away. The island became louder, yes, but perhaps also lonelier. Today, traces of that world survive in records, in oral histories, in the hands of descendants who still remember a sign or two passed down through family. Linguists study Martha's Vineyard Sign Language as a piece of the puzzle that later influenced American Sign Language. Historians trace the genealogies, uncovering how an isolated community produced a linguistic miracle out of what the world called a disability. Tourists walk the same fields and shores, unaware that beneath their feet once lay a culture of silence woven into every stone wall and fishing net. The ghosts that haunt Chilmark are not spirits of the dead, but echoes of hands moving in the dark, telling stories that no voice could ever capture. The epilogue of Martha's Vineyard's mute town, then, is not a clean ending, but a lingering resonance. It asks unsettling questions. What does it mean to lose a language of silence? What does it mean for tragedy to unfold without sound? Can an entire way of being vanish without leaving behind something more than memory? For those who lived it, silence was never strange. For those of us who look back, it feels uncanny, as though the island belonged to another world altogether. Perhaps that is why the story endures, because it unsettles, because it forces us to consider silence not as void, but as presence, because it reminds us that the strangest mysteries are not always about ghosts or curses, but about the ways people live and the ways they are misunderstood. The village of Martha's Vineyard was never a haunted place. It was a human place, fragile, resilient, marked by storms and funerals, by laughter unseen but deeply felt. And yet, to stand there now, with the wind rattling through the old graveyards, is to feel that silence pressing close again, as though the island still carries its secret. The people are gone, their signs fading into the past. The houses are quieter, in a different way now. But if you listen, not with your ears, but with something deeper, you may still sense the conversation that once unfolded in every cottage, the grief that passed from hand to hand at every funeral, the resilience that carried through storms without a cry. It is a silence that will never truly vanish, because it has been written into the island's soil, into its story, into the imaginations of those who hear it told. The epilogue is not a closure. It is an open space, a silence left behind. And in that silence, the mystery endures. An island once alive with hands in motion, remembered forever as the place where voices were not needed, where silence spoke louder than words, and where history itself seems to pause, holding its breath, waiting for us to listen.